South Korea built an economic miracle, then used it to destroy itself. Think about that for a second. The same corporations that transformed a war-torn nation into a global powerhouse are now driving its people to despair at the highest rates in the developed world. Here's the brutal math. 5 companies control 45% of South Korea's entire economy. Samsung alone accounts for 23% of GDP. These corporate giants, called chaebols, have more power than most governments. But here's where it gets dark. While these mega corporations generate nearly half the country's wealth, they employ just 10% of its workers. The rest? They're trapped in an economic system so broken that South Korea now holds the most devastating record in the OECD, a suicide rate of 24.1 per 100,000 people. And it's about to get worse. What you're about to discover is how a handful of families built empires on the backs of an entire nation, and why their success is quite literally killing the country that made them rich. This isn't just an economic story, it's a warning about what happens when corporate power goes unchecked. Because the very system that made South Korea great is now tearing it apart. Picture Seoul in the 1960s. Dirt roads, makeshift markets, a city that looked more like a refugee camp than a future tech capital. South Korea was poorer than North Korea. Let that sink in. The country we now associate with Samsung phones and Hyundai cars had a lower GDP per capita than its communist neighbor up until the mid-1970s. The Korean War had destroyed everything. Only 74.4% of the population could read. The economy was basically subsistence farming. And then came Park Chung-hee. In 1961, this military general seized power and made a decision that would change everything. But it wasn't what you'd expect. Instead of opening up the economy to free competition, Park did something almost unthinkable. He handpicked a few family businesses and gave them everything. Cheap loans, tax breaks, protection from competition, even bailouts when they screwed up. These chosen families would become the chaebols, a word that literally means wealth clan. The deal was simple. We'll give you unlimited support, you give us rapid economic growth, and if you fail, don't worry, we'll bail you out. Samsung started as a company selling dried fish and fruit to China. Hyundai was a small construction firm. LG made cosmetics. But with government backing, they transformed overnight into industrial giants. Here's where things get interesting and slightly sinister. The government didn't just support these companies, it actively crushed their competition. Small businesses were denied loans that chaebols got for free. Foreign companies were blocked from entering the market. If you weren't part of the chosen few, you were nobody. And the chaebols knew it. They expanded into everything: electronics, cars, ships, insurance, hotels, even universities. Why stick to one industry when the government guarantees you can't fail? By the 1970s, the transformation was shocking. The same country that couldn't feed itself was now exporting cars and electronics globally. The miracle on the Han River had begun. But here's what nobody talks about. This wasn't a miracle. It was a deal with the devil, and the bill was about to come due. The chaebols needed workers, millions of them, but not just any workers. They needed engineers, accountants, managers. The problem? Most Koreans couldn't even read. So the government launched what might be the most aggressive education campaign in human history. They didn't just promote education, they made it a national obsession. The message was hammered into every family: no degree, no future; no university, no job; no job, no life. And Koreans bought it hard. Within a single generation, South Korea went from 74.4% literacy to the most educated country on earth. Today, over 70% of young Koreans have university degrees, the highest rate in the world. But you haven't heard the most shocking part yet. The chaebols didn't just want educated workers, they wanted devoted workers. So they created a work culture that would make even the most hardcore Silicon Valley startup look lazy. Working 12-hour days became normal, then 14, then 16. Leaving before your boss? Career suicide. Taking vacation? You clearly aren't committed to the company. Having a life outside work? What are you, a traitor? The companies introduced after-work drinking sessions and made them mandatory. Miss one? You're not a team player. Try to go home to see your family? You obviously don't care about the company that feeds you. South Koreans now work more hours than any other developed nation. And here's the kicker, it worked. Exports exploded from 4% of GDP in 1961 to over 40% by 2016. The economy grew at 8% annually for decades. Samsung became a global tech giant. Hyundai cars appeared on roads worldwide. The chaebols had delivered on their promise. But while everyone celebrated the miracle, nobody noticed the poison spreading through Korean society. The education system had become a pressure cooker. 5-year-olds were attending cram schools until midnight. Families were spending up to 16% of their income on private tutoring. The government literally had to ban tutoring after 10 p.m. because children were collapsing from exhaustion. The work culture had turned toxic. South Korea developed the world's highest rates of death from overwork. Families fell apart, birth rates plummeted, and then came the moment everything changed. Here's where our story takes a dark turn. Remember how chaebols were supposed to create jobs for all those educated Koreans? Well, they found a loophole. The numbers are staggering. The top 10 chaebols now generate 60% of South Korea's GDP, but they employ just 10% of the workforce. How is this possible? The chaebols got smart. They automated factories. They outsourced production. They focused on high-tech industries that need fewer workers. Why hire 10,000 people when 1,000 engineers and robots can do the same job? This created a nightmare scenario that's destroying Korean society from within. Every year, Korean universities pump out 528,240 graduates. They've spent their entire lives preparing for chaebol jobs, the only jobs that matter in Korean society. But those jobs, they barely exist. Youth unemployment hit 7.3% in 2025, and that's the official number. The real situation is much worse. Millions of young Koreans are stuck in temporary, low-paying jobs despite having perfect grades and multiple degrees. According to Statistics Korea, there were 4.058 million people in the country with a college degree who were considered an economically inactive population. But wait, there's a sick irony here. While educated Koreans can't find work, the country faces a massive labor shortage in blue-collar jobs. Construction sites sit empty. Factories can't find workers. Why? Because in a society that spent decades telling everyone that only chaebol jobs matter, nobody wants to be seen as a failure. The government got so desperate it launched programs to send Korean graduates abroad, essentially admitting the country can employ its own people. Think about that. South Korea educated its population to the highest level in the world, only to tell them, sorry, we don't have jobs for you. Try Canada. And here's the most devastating part. The chaebols like it this way. With thousands competing for every position, they can demand absolute loyalty, pay less, and work people harder. It's supply and demand, and they control the supply. This is what happens when success becomes a trap. If you're finding this deep dive valuable, consider hitting subscribe and the notification bell. Your support helps us continue bringing these important global stories to light. Now let's get back to how this system destroys the very people it claims to serve. The numbers paint a picture of a society in collapse, and they're getting worse every year. In 2024, South Korea officially became the most unequal society in Asia. The top 10% now hold 44.4% of total household net worth. The bottom 50%, they're fighting over scraps. Income inequality has returned to levels not seen since the Japanese colonial era. But it's the human cost that's truly devastating. Let's start with the elderly. These are the people who built the miracle. They worked 80-hour weeks in chaebol factories. They sacrificed everything for their children's education. They believed in the promise that hard work would be rewarded. Today, 39% of South Korea's elderly live in poverty, the highest rate in the OECD. Why? Because the tradition of children supporting aging parents has collapsed. Young people can barely support themselves, let alone their parents. So what do the elderly do? They make a choice that's becoming horrifyingly common. They kill themselves rather than burden their families. South Korea's elderly suicide rate is the highest in the world. These aren't just statistics, these are people choosing death over poverty. But that's just the beginning of the horror. In 2023, suicide became the leading cause of death for Koreans aged 10 to 39. Think about that. More young people die by their own hand than from accidents, disease, or any other cause. The pressure starts early. Nearly 27% of middle and high school students have contemplated suicide due to academic stress. They're not even adults yet, and they're already broken by a system that demands perfection but offers no rewards. During COVID, something even darker emerged, what Korean media called the silent massacre. Young women's suicide rates skyrocketed. Why? Because women already discriminated against in hiring lost their service industry jobs en masse. No safety net, no support, no hope. But there's another killer stalking South Korea's workforce, one that doesn't even make it into the suicide statistics. They call it gorosa, death from overwork. Just like Japan's karoshi, it's become so common they need a word for it. In 2021 alone, 565 Koreans died from overwork-related causes: heart attacks, strokes, collapsing at their desks. That's more than one person every single day dying because they literally worked themselves to death. And these are just the officially recognized cases. The real number? Much higher. The government knows this is happening. In 2018, they passed a law reducing maximum working hours from 68 to 52 per week. But here's the sick joke. In 2023, they tried to raise it back up to 69 hours. The proposal would have made it legal to work from 9 a.m. to midnight, 5 days straight. Only massive protests from young workers stopped it. Even after reducing working hours, South Korea still holds the record for the longest annual work hours among developed nations, averaging 1,915 hours per year. In stark contrast, workers in Germany clock in just 1,349 hours annually. Postal workers, delivery drivers, and public officials are dropping dead at their desks. The Korea Workers' Compensation and Welfare Service now recognizes heart attacks and strokes as work-related if you've been working more than 60 hours a week for 3 months. But here's what's truly dystopian. The chaebols see this as a feature, not a bug. Dead workers can't complain about conditions. Exhausted workers can't organize unions. Desperate workers accept any terms. The system that kills is the system that profits. Here's a detail that will haunt you. The Mapo Bridge in Seoul is nicknamed Suicide Bridge. So many people jumped that the city installed a bronze statue with the inscription, "My friend, think about it one more time." It hasn't helped. The numbers keep rising. But surely the successful ones are happy, right? Wrong. South Korea ranks 33rd out of 38 OECD countries in life satisfaction. Even those with chaebol jobs report misery. The work culture that built the miracle has become a prison. This is what happens when an entire society is structured to benefit a few families at the expense of everyone else. The chaebols got their miracle. Everyone else got the spare. You might think, surely someone's trying to fix this. That's where our story gets even darker. The chaebols aren't just economically powerful, they own the system. Let's talk about Samsung's Lee family. They've been convicted of bribery, tax evasion, and embezzlement multiple times. The punishment? Presidential pardons every single time. The Lee family saga reads like a crime novel. J.Y. Lee, Samsung's de facto leader, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for bribing President Park Geun-hye with $38 million. He served less than a year. Why? The Seoul High Court decided Samsung was too big to jail. They literally said the country's economy couldn't function without him. But it gets worse. In 2024, Lee was earning $260 million annually, while average Korean workers saw their real wages stagnate. That's more money in one day than most Koreans see in a lifetime. And remember, this is a convicted criminal we're talking about. Why? The government's excuse is always the same. Samsung is too important to the economy. When you control 23% of GDP, you're not a company, you're a nation within a nation. The corruption is almost comedic in its brazenness. In 2018, former President Lee Myung-bak, himself a former Hyundai executive, was convicted of taking $5.8 million in bribes from Samsung. His predecessor, Park Geun-hye, was impeached for taking bribes from chaebols. The current system is so corrupt that 2 recent presidents have gone to jail, yet nothing changes. But here's my favorite example of chaebol privilege: the nut rage incident. In 2014, the daughter of Korean Air's chairman Heather Cho forced a plane to return to the gate because she was served macadamia nuts in a bag instead of on a plate. She physically assaulted the crew chief. The sentence? A few months in jail, then back to her executive position. This is the reality. If you're born into a chaebol family, you're untouchable. The rest of Korea? They're expendable. The chaebols don't just buy politicians, they buy entire systems. When Hyundai needed land for a new factory, local residents who refused to sell suddenly found their water cut off. When LG wanted favorable regulations, government officials who opposed them were mysteriously reassigned. When SK Group faced antitrust charges, the lead prosecutor's son magically got accepted to a prestigious university. Here's a number that should terrify you. In 2023, chaebols spent over $2 billion on lobbying activities. And that's just the official figure. The real amount? Nobody knows. Because when you own the banks, the media, and the regulators, you don't need to report everything. The chaebols have perfected regulatory capture. They donate millions to politicians. They hire former regulators. They own media companies that shape public opinion. When accidents happen, like the Seawall ferry disaster that killed 304 people, mostly students, investigations reveal chains of corruption linking chaebols to regulators who ignored safety violations. Let me tell more about the Seawall ferry, because it perfectly illustrates how chaebol corruption kills. The ferry was overloaded with cargo to maximize profits. Safety inspections were faked. The crew was untrained. When it started sinking, students were told to stay in their cabins while the crew escaped. Those 250 high school students died because a chaebol company decided safety regulations were optional. The owner? He was found dead before trial. The company executives? Most got suspended sentences. The families? They're still protesting for justice a decade later. But the chaebols learned nothing. In 2022, the Itaewon crowd crush killed 159 young people. Why? Because safety planning would have cost money. Because profit matters more than lives. Because in chaebol Korea, ordinary people are expendable. But surely international pressure could force change. Think again. Foreign investors actively avoid Korean companies. Despite their size, chaebols trade at a Korea discount because investors know minority shareholders get screwed. The ownership structures are so complex, with families controlling empires through tiny stakes, that corporate governance is a joke. Here's the trap. The chaebols are too big to fail but too powerful to reform. If Samsung collapsed, it would take the Korean economy with it. The government knows this. The chaebols know this. So the dance continues. A 2023 survey found 61% of Koreans support chaebol reform. But what are they going to do? Vote for politicians funded by chaebols? Work for companies owned by chaebols? Buy products made by chaebols? The system has become a cancer, but removing it might kill the patient. So where does South Korea go from here? The country stands at an impossible crossroads, and every path leads through pain. The startup revolution offers a glimmer of hope. Since 2020, the number of Korean startups has exploded to 1,182,905. Young Koreans shut out of chaebol jobs are creating their own companies. The number of unicorns, startups worth over $1 billion, has grown sevenfold in recent years. But here's the catch. Even successful startups often end up bought by chaebols. Kakao, once Korea's startup darling, is now just another conglomerate. The system consumes everything. The government talks about reform. They've tried everything: higher taxes on chaebols, support for smaller businesses, anti-monopoly laws. Nothing sticks. Why? Because implementing real reform would mean economic catastrophe. The chaebols have made themselves indispensable. Think about it. If Samsung's grip on the economy loosens, foreign competitors would flood in. Korean companies, sheltered for decades, would collapse. Millions would lose jobs. The very reforms meant to help people would destroy them first. Some economists propose a gradual transition, slowly reducing chaebol power over decades. But South Korea doesn't have decades. The youth are fleeing the country. The birth rate has collapsed to 0.75, the lowest in the world. The population is aging rapidly. The clock is ticking. Here's the brutal truth. South Korea is trapped in a prison of its own making. The chaebols delivered on their promise. They made Korea rich, but the price was the soul of the nation. The numbers tell a story of a slow-motion catastrophe. In 2024, South Korea's debt-to-GDP ratio hit 46.8%, up from 37% just 6 years ago. Why? Because the government keeps bailing out chaebols while cutting social services. They'd rather save a corrupt corporation than feed the elderly. Meanwhile, real estate prices in Seoul have become so insane that young people have given up on ever owning homes. The average apartment now costs 18 times the median annual income. In the 1990s, it was 3 times. Young Koreans have a word for their generation, N-Posdae, the generation that gives up on everything. Dating, marriage, children, homes, careers, hope, everything. The brain drain has accelerated dramatically. Over the past decade, approximately 340,000 South Korean STEM professionals have left the country, seeking better opportunities abroad. In 2022 alone, 40% of AI professionals who completed graduate programs in South Korea moved overseas. These aren't low-skilled workers seeking opportunity. These are the brightest minds, the top graduates, the future innovators. They're fleeing to Silicon Valley, London, Singapore, anywhere but home. And who can blame them? In surveys, 89% of young Korean women and 82% of men agree that people born into poverty can never compete with those born into wealth. They've given up on the Korean dream because they've realized it was always a lie. The game was rigged from the start. The mental health crisis has reached epidemic proportions. Korea spends less on mental health care than any developed nation, just 2.5% of its health budget. There's one psychiatrist for every 20,000 people. Therapy is stigmatized. Antidepressants are seen as weakness. Is it any wonder the suicide rate keeps climbing? But here's the cruelest irony. Even as people suffer, the chaebols keep getting richer. A report from the World Inequality Lab in 2022 stated that the bottom 50% of South Koreans held just 5.6% of the country's wealth. While elderly people sort recyclables for pennies, chaebol heirs spend millions on supercars and Swiss chalets. The question isn't whether the system will change, it's whether Korea will survive long enough to see it happen. What would you choose? Economic collapse with the hope of rebuilding fairly, or maintaining a system that's literally killing your people? Because that's the choice South Korea faces. The miracle is over. The bill has come due. And there's no easy way out of the trap they built for themselves. The chaebols made South Korea great, then they broke it. And the worst part? Everyone knows it, but nobody can stop it. The miracle on the Han River has become a nightmare, and it's only just beginning. The country that achieved the impossible, transforming from rubble to riches in a single generation, has become a case study in how success can destroy a society. International economists now study South Korea not as a model to emulate, but as a warning. The World Bank recently published a report titled The Chaebol Trap, When Corporate Concentration Undermines National Development. The IMF warns that Korea's economic model is unsustainable and approaching critical failure. But perhaps the most damning verdict comes from young Koreans themselves. In the 2024 survey, when asked what word best describes their country, the top answer wasn't prosperous or advanced or successful. It was hell. They call it Hell Joseon, a medieval kingdom where your birth determines your fate, where the powerful feast while the powerless starve, where hope is a luxury few can afford. This is what happens when you build a country for corporations instead of people, when you sacrifice everything for GDP growth, when you let a handful of families hold an entire nation hostage. The chaebols won. They got everything they wanted: wealth, power, impunity. They built their empires on the broken dreams of millions. They turned a country's greatest strength, its people, into its greatest weakness. And now those people are choosing death over life in the paradise the chaebols built. The miracle is dead. The nightmare has just begun, and there's no waking up from this one. What do you think? Can South Korea escape the chaebol trap, or is it already too late? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into South Korea's dark economic reality valuable, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're Fall of Nations, and we uncover the hidden truths behind the world's biggest economic stories. And if you want to see how other economic miracles turned into nightmares, check out our video on the dark truth why Japan is giving away free houses. The link is on your screen now. Trust me, the parallels will shock you. Thanks for watching. Until next time.